The morning mist hung low over Buckingham Palace, as the royal household prepared for what seemed like another ordinary day. Queen Camilla sat in her private study, reviewing correspondence with her secretary when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the marble corridors. The queen consort looked up from her papers, a slight frown creasing her brow as she noticed the urgency in the approaching footfalls. Captain James Morrison, head of the Royal Guard, appeared at her doorway. His usually composed demeanor carried an unusual tension that immediately caught Camilla's attention. Behind him stood 3 senior guards, their expressions grave and professional. The captain's uniform was immaculate as always, but something in his bearing suggested this was no routine visit. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Camilla set down her fountain pen. "I must speak with you regarding a matter of utmost importance to the crown." Camilla gestured for him to enter, her mind already racing through possibilities. In her years as queen consort, she had grown accustomed to various protocols and procedures, but the formal manner of this approach felt different. The guards remained standing at attention as Captain Morrison stepped forward, holding a sealed document that bore the official royal seal. "What is this about, Captain?" Camilla asked, rising from her chair with the dignity that had become second nature to her. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the ornate room, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Captain Morrison's response would change everything. "Your Majesty, I am acting under direct orders from the Privy Council and in accordance with ancient royal protocols that have been invoked due to recent discoveries." His words hung in the air like a challenge to the very foundations of the first monarchy. The sealed document in his hands contained information that had been uncovered through months of careful investigation, intelligence reports, financial records, and communications that painted a picture of activities that, while not criminal, called into question the suitability of certain members of the royal family to maintain their positions. The investigation had been conducted in absolute secrecy, known only to a select few within the highest echelons of the royal household and government. Camilla's face remained composed, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she reached for the document. Years of royal training had taught her to maintain composure in any situation, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to learn. The investigation had revealed a complex web of influence peddling and questionable associations that, while technically legal, violated the strict moral and ethical standards expected of the royal family. "The findings detailed in this document," Captain Morrison continued, "have been reviewed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and the Prime Minister. They have concluded that immediate action must be taken to preserve the integrity of the crown." His words carried the weight of centuries of royal tradition and the unbending nature of institutional duty. As Camilla broke the seal and began to read, the color drained from her face. The document outlined how certain charitable organizations she had been associated with had been used as fronts for wealthy donors seeking access to royal influence. Phone conversations had been recorded, meetings documented, and financial trails traced that showed a pattern of behavior that, while not illegal, compromised the political neutrality that was fundamental to the monarchy's survival. The investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower within one of the charitable organizations who had grown concerned about the increasing commercialization of royal access. This individual had provided evidence of donors being promised private audiences with senior royals in exchange for substantial donations, and of policy discussions taking place that should have been left to elected officials. Captain Morrison waited patiently as Camilla absorbed the information. He understood the gravity of what was happening and felt genuine sympathy for the queen consort, but his duty to the crown superseded personal feelings. The Royal Guard had served as protectors of the monarchy for centuries, and sometimes that protection required making difficult decisions about threats that came from within. "The Privy Council has determined," he continued when Camilla finally looked up from the document, "that your continued tenure as queen consort poses a risk to the constitutional monarchy. They have invoked the Royal Succession Emergency Protocol, a mechanism that has existed in various forms since the time of Henry VIII, but has never before been used in modern times." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla set the document down with deliberate care, her mind processing not just the immediate implications for herself, but for the entire royal family. She thought of King Charles, who was currently on a state visit to Australia and completely unaware of the crisis unfolding at home. "What exactly are you saying, Captain?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Her voice remained steady, a testament to the strength of character that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges. "Your Majesty, I am here to inform you that the Privy Council has voted to strip you of your titles and remove you from the line of succession. Furthermore, they have determined that Prince William, as heir apparent, must be invested with emergency powers to act as regent until King Charles can return and address this crisis." The words hit Camilla like physical blows, each one carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of a legal document. She understood immediately that this was not a negotiation or a request for her cooperation. This was a decision that had already been made by the most powerful institutions in the British system of government. The ancient protocols being invoked dated back to times when the survival of the monarchy required swift and sometimes brutal action to remove threats to the crown's legitimacy. These mechanisms had been designed to protect the institution even from those within it, who might, through their actions, endanger its very existence. Captain Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew another document, this one bearing multiple seals and signatures. "This is the formal decree, signed by the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the senior members of the Privy Council. It details the immediate transfer of your ceremonial duties to Prince William and the process by which he will assume temporary regency powers." Camilla took the second document with hands that had steadied as she processed the reality of her situation. She had survived the transition from being seen as the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage to becoming a respected member of the royal family. She had weathered decades of media scrutiny and public skepticism. But this challenge was different because it came from within the very institution she had worked so hard to serve. "The Prince of Wales has been notified and is en route to the palace," Captain Morrison added. "He will arrive within the hour to begin the transition process. Your personal staff has been informed that they are to assist with your departure from royal residences and the transfer of your official duties." The efficiency of the operation was breathtaking in its scope and speed. Every detail had been planned and coordinated with military precision. Security protocols had been adjusted, staff reassigned, and communication systems rerouted to ensure that the transition would proceed smoothly and without public disruption. Camilla walked to the window and looked out at the palace gardens where tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. They had no idea that history was being written just a few hundred yards away from where they stood taking photographs and buying souvenirs. The normalcy of the scene outside contrasted sharply with the constitutional crisis playing out within the palace walls. "How long do I have?" she asked, turning back to face Captain Morrison. The question was practical rather than emotional, reflecting her understanding that resistance would be futile and that her best option was to maintain her dignity throughout the process. "You may remain in the palace until this evening to gather your personal belongings," he replied. "Transport has been arranged to take you to a private residence, where you will remain until the public announcement is made and the situation stabilizes. Your security detail will remain in place, but under modified protocols." The mention of security reminded Camilla of another harsh reality. She would no longer be under the protection of the Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Branch as a working member of the royal family. Instead, she would have private security funded by her personal resources, a significant step down that underscored the finality of what was happening. As if reading her thoughts, Captain Morrison added, "The transition team has prepared a comprehensive briefing on your new status and the practical implications. Financial arrangements have been made to ensure your security and comfort, but these will be significantly different from your current situation." Camilla nodded, understanding that even in her disgrace, the institution was handling her departure with a level of care designed to minimize potential embarrassment to the crown. The royal family had extensive experience in managing difficult transitions and scandals, and they applied these lessons even when dealing with threats from within their own ranks. The sound of vehicles arriving in the palace courtyard drew everyone's attention to the windows. Prince William's convoy was approaching earlier than expected, suggesting that the urgency of the situation had compressed the timeline even further. Camilla could see the familiar outline of his official car, followed by security vehicles and support staff. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said, stepping forward slightly. Prince William has requested a private audience with you before the formal transition begins. He wishes to discuss the arrangements personally and ensure that the process proceeds with as much dignity as possible for all involved. This gesture from William surprised Camilla. Despite their sometimes complicated relationship, he was demonstrating the kind of leadership and compassion that would serve him well as the future king. She appreciated that he wanted to handle this personally rather than delegating it entirely to officials and protocol officers. The few minutes before William's arrival passed in tense silence. Camilla used the time to compose herself mentally for what would certainly be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. She had watched William grow from a grieving child into a mature leader, and she respected both his judgment and his commitment to the monarchy. When Prince William entered the room, his expression was serious but not unkind. He was accompanied only by his private secretary, suggesting that he wanted this conversation to be as personal as possible under the circumstances. His bearing showed the weight of the responsibility that was being placed on his shoulders. "Camilla," he said, using her name rather than her title in a way that somehow made the moment both more personal and more final. "I want you to know that this decision was not made lightly, and that I take no pleasure in what must happen today." His words carried genuine regret, but also the unmistakable authority of someone who had accepted the burden of leadership in a crisis. William had been preparing for kingship his entire life, but he had not expected to exercise royal authority in such dramatic circumstances while his father was still on the throne. The conversation that followed would set the tone for everything that came next. The future king and the deposed queen consort faced each other across a room that had witnessed countless moments of royal history, adding another chapter to the ongoing story of a monarchy adapting to survive in an ever-changing world. Prince William moved across the room with measured steps, his presence filling the space with an authority that seemed to have materialized overnight. The weight of emergency regency powers rested on his shoulders like an invisible crown, transforming him from heir apparent to acting sovereign in a matter of hours. Camilla observed this transformation with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, recognizing that the institution was already moving beyond her. "The evidence presented to the Privy Council was overwhelming," William began, his voice carrying both firmness and regret. "The recordings, the financial trails, the documented promises of access in exchange for donations, the constitutional lawyers made it clear that your position had become untenable." Camilla listened as William detailed the extent of the investigation that had been conducted without her knowledge. Phone conversations with wealthy donors had been intercepted through legal surveillance warrants. Banking records had been subpoenaed, showing suspicious patterns of charitable donations, followed immediately by private royal meetings. Most damaging of all were recorded conversations where she had discussed pending government policies with foreign business interests. The conversation with the Russian Energy Consortium was particularly problematic, William continued, his diplomatic training evident in his careful word choice. "When you discussed the North Sea drilling permits 3 days before the Energy Secretary announced the policy change, it created the appearance of insider information being shared inappropriately." The mention of that specific conversation made Camilla's heart sink. She remembered the dinner party where she had been seated next to Viktor Petrov, the consortium's representative. What she had intended as polite conversation about British energy policy had been interpreted as a breach of the constitutional requirement that royals remain politically neutral. The fact that her charity had received a substantial donation from Petrov's foundation the following week had created an appearance of corruption that was impossible to explain away. Captain Morrison remained at attention near the door, but his presence had faded into the background as the conversation between the two principals intensified. This was no longer about protocol and procedure. This was about the survival of an institution that had weathered world wars, political upheavals, and social revolutions by adapting when necessary and taking decisive action when survival was at stake. The Prime Minister was prepared to make this a public matter, William revealed, a detail that sent chills through Camilla. The opposition parties were already asking questions in Parliament about royal finances and political neutrality. "We had perhaps days before this became a full-scale constitutional crisis, with unpredictable consequences for the monarchy itself." Camilla began to understand the broader context of her removal. This was not just about her individual actions, but about protecting the entire institution from a scandal that could have triggered a serious debate about the monarchy's future in British society. The investigation had revealed that opposition politicians were already preparing parliamentary questions that could have exposed the full extent of the problem and potentially triggered calls for constitutional reform. Your cooperation in this process, William continued, will determine how this situation is presented to the public. We can frame this as a voluntary stepping back for health reasons, or we can allow the facts to speak for themselves through official channels. The implicit threat was clear but delivered with diplomatic elegance. Camilla could choose to participate in a face-saving narrative that would protect her personal dignity, or she could resist and face public exposure of the evidence that had led to her removal. For someone who had spent years rebuilding her reputation after the Diana years, the choice was obvious. What about Charles? Camilla asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since Captain Morrison's arrival. Her husband was halfway around the world, conducting state business while his wife's world collapsed around her. The personal dimension of this crisis was as devastating as the institutional implications. William's expression softened slightly at the mention of his father. He has been informed and is returning immediately. His plane will land at RAF Northolt in approximately 8 hours. Until then, I am exercising emergency powers under the Regency Protocol to ensure continuity of royal functions. The mechanism being used was both ancient and unprecedented in its modern application. The Regency Protocol allowed for the temporary transfer of royal authority in extraordinary circumstances, but it had never before been invoked to address a crisis involving the monarch's spouse. Legal scholars were probably already debating the constitutional implications of what was happening. The formal ceremony will take place this afternoon, William explained. The Lord Chamberlain will conduct the investiture of emergency powers in the throne room. The ceremony will be recorded for historical purposes, but will not be broadcast live. Selected members of the Privy Council, senior clergy, and military leadership will be in attendance. The speed at which events were moving reflected the urgent need to establish legitimate authority before news of the crisis leaked to the press. Every hour of delay increased the risk that the carefully orchestrated transition would be overwhelmed by public speculation and media frenzy. The royal household's extensive experience in crisis management was being put to its ultimate test. Camilla walked to her desk and began gathering personal items, a gesture that symbolized her acceptance of the inevitable. The silver-framed photographs of family moments, the personal correspondence from friends, the small treasures that had made this office feel like her own space. Each item represented memories that would now be colored by the circumstances of her departure. The staff has been briefed, William said, watching her careful selection of belongings. They understand that this transition is being conducted with respect for your years of service to the Crown. Personal items from your other residences will be packed and delivered to your new accommodation. The practical arrangements had been planned with military efficiency. Moving trucks were already stationed at Clarence House and other royal residences to collect Camilla's possessions. Security sweeps were being conducted to ensure that no sensitive materials remained behind. Even her personal computer and mobile devices would be replaced to prevent any potential security breaches. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. William's private secretary entered with a silver tray bearing the formal documents that would complete the transfer of authority. The papers were bound in blue silk ribbon and sealed with red wax, following traditions that dated back centuries, while addressing a thoroughly modern constitutional crisis. The investiture ceremony will begin in 30 minutes, the secretary announced. The participants are assembling in the throne room, and the Lord Chamberlain is prepared to proceed when your Royal Highness is ready. William nodded and turned back to Camilla. This is your final opportunity to address any personal matters or make any requests regarding the public announcement. Once the ceremony begins, the institutional machinery will take over and individual preferences become secondary to state requirements. Camilla considered her options carefully. She could request that the announcement emphasize her voluntary departure and her desire to focus on private charitable work. She could ask for a delay to allow her to personally inform friends and family before the news became public. Or she could simply accept whatever narrative the palace chose to construct around her removal. I would like to prepare a statement, she decided. Something brief that acknowledges the transition while maintaining some dignity. I assume it will need to be approved before release? Of course, William agreed. The press office will work with you on the language to ensure it aligns with the official announcement. We want this to appear as seamless and amicable as possible. The mention of the press office reminded both of them that this private drama would soon become a public spectacle. Royal correspondents would analyze every word of the announcement for hidden meanings. International media would speculate about the implications for the monarchy's stability. Social media would explode with theories and accusations that bore little resemblance to the careful constitutional process actually taking place. Captain Morrison stepped forward as the conversation appeared to be concluding. "Your Majesty, the security transition will begin after the ceremony. Your new detail will escort you to the private residence that has been prepared. The location will remain confidential for security reasons, but it offers complete privacy and all necessary amenities." The new residence was actually a grace and favor property owned by the Crown Estate, chosen for its security features and its distance from London's media concentration. Camilla would be comfortable there, but she would also be effectively isolated from the royal world that had been her life for so many years. "The financial arrangements," William added, addressing another practical concern, "will ensure your security and comfort. The settlement includes provisions for housing, security, transportation, and a personal staff. These arrangements are permanent and will not be subject to review or modification." This generous settlement was both a recognition of Camilla's years of service and an insurance policy against future problems. A comfortable former queen consort was much less likely to become a source of embarrassing revelations or public criticism than one left to struggle with reduced circumstances. The sound of ceremonial drums echoing through the palace corridors signaled that the formal proceedings were about to begin. The household cavalry was taking their positions for a ceremony that would be unlike anything in their extensive ceremonial experience. They were participating in the constitutional equivalent of a surgical procedure, removing a threat to the monarchy with precision and minimal damage to the institution itself. William straightened his uniform jacket and checked his appearance in the gilded mirror that had reflected the faces of monarchs for generations. In a few minutes, he would accept powers that he had never expected to exercise under these circumstances. The irony was not lost on him that his preparation for kingship was being accelerated by the removal of the woman who had become his stepmother. "Are you ready?" he asked Camilla, extending his arm in a gesture that combined personal courtesy with constitutional necessity. They would walk to the throne room together, presenting a united front that would reinforce the narrative of orderly transition rather than crisis and conflict. Camilla placed her hand on his arm and nodded. "I'm ready," she said simply. Her composure had returned as she accepted her fate and focused on maintaining her dignity throughout the remaining formalities. Years of royal training had prepared her for many challenging situations, and that preparation was serving her well now. As they left the study together, Camilla took one final look at the room that had been her working space as queen consort. The morning light was stronger now, illuminating the formal portraits and ceremonial objects that would remain while their former guardian departed forever. History was moving forward, as it always did, leaving behind those who could not adapt to its demands. The walk through the palace corridors took them past staff members who had served Camilla faithfully for years. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but she could see the shock and sadness in their eyes. These people had become her extended family, and leaving them was perhaps the most painful aspect of her departure. The throne room doors were already open, revealing the assembled dignitaries who would witness this unprecedented ceremony. The Lord Chamberlain stood at the center of the room, holding the ceremonial rod of office that would symbolically transfer royal authority from the absent monarch to his heir. Ancient words would be spoken to address a thoroughly modern crisis, proving once again that the monarchy's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt while maintaining the appearance of unchanging tradition. The throne room had been transformed into a stage for constitutional history. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting dramatic shadows across the assembled dignitaries who represented the pillars of British institutional power. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood in his ceremonial robes, the Prime Minister wore his most formal suit, and senior military officers displayed their dress uniforms adorned with medals that reflected decades of service to the crown. Prince William entered the room with Camilla at his side, their measured steps echoing across the polished marble floor. The assembled witnesses rose in unison, creating a rustling of fabric that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment. This was no ordinary royal ceremony. but rather an emergency measure designed to preserve the monarchy's stability in the face of an unprecedented crisis. The Lord Chamberlain, Earl of Airlie, stepped forward carrying the ornate staff of office that symbolized royal authority. His weathered face bore the weight of his role as the senior official responsible for the royal household's administration. He had served 3 monarchs during his tenure and had never imagined he would preside over such a ceremony. "Your Royal Highness," the Lord Chamberlain began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we are gathered here in extraordinary circumstances to invoke ancient protocols designed to protect the crown and ensure continuity of royal authority during times of constitutional emergency." The formal language masked the revolutionary nature of what was occurring. For the first time in modern history, the monarchy was exercising its most dramatic internal defense mechanism, removing a threat from within its own ranks, while simultaneously transferring unprecedented powers to the heir apparent. William stepped forward, separating himself from Camilla in a gesture that symbolized the institutional divide that now existed between them. His transformation from supporting player to central figure in the monarchy was complete, and every person in the room understood that they were witnessing the emergence of a new phase of royal leadership. The Privy Council, acting under emergency powers granted by ancient statute and confirmed by constitutional precedent, has determined that extraordinary measures are required to preserve the dignity and integrity of the crown. The Lord Chamberlain continued. His words were being recorded for historical archives and would be studied by constitutional scholars for generations to come. Camilla stood motionless as the formal charges were read aloud. The language was diplomatic but devastating, detailing how her actions had compromised the political neutrality essential to the crown's constitutional role, and had created appearances of improper influence that threatened public confidence in the monarchy's integrity. The evidence was presented in summary form, each allegation supported by documentation that had been verified by independent investigators. The Russian Energy Consortium meeting, the recorded conversations with Chinese infrastructure investors, the Caribbean tax haven consultation that had preceded policy announcements by 2 days. Each incident alone might have been dismissed as coincidence, but together they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The investigation, conducted over 6 months by security services acting under warrant, has established beyond doubt that information sharing occurred that violated the fundamental principle of royal political neutrality, the Archbishop added, lending moral authority to the institutional decision. The Church's involvement was crucial because it provided spiritual legitimacy to what could otherwise be seen as a purely political maneuver. The Archbishop's presence signified that this action was being taken to protect not just the monarchy's constitutional role, but also its moral authority as the symbolic head of the established Church. Prince William listened to the formal presentation with an expression of controlled determination. He had spent the morning in emergency consultations with constitutional experts, security officials, and senior civil servants who had briefed him on the extraordinary powers he was about to receive. The regency mechanism being invoked had been designed for situations where the monarch was incapacitated, not for removing threats posed by the monarch's spouse. "Your Royal Highness," the Lord Chamberlain said, turning to William, "do you accept the temporary regency powers being conferred upon you by the Privy Council? And do you swear to exercise these powers in the best interests of the Crown and the constitutional monarchy?" William's response would complete his transformation from heir apparent to acting sovereign. "I do accept these powers, and I swear before God and this assembly to exercise them with wisdom, justice, and dedication to the principles that have sustained the monarchy through centuries of service to the British people." The ceremonial staff was transferred from the Lord Chamberlain to Prince William, a moment that was photographed by the official palace photographer for historical records. The image would eventually appear in constitutional textbooks as documentation of one of the most unusual transfers of power in British history. As William grasped the staff of office, Camilla stepped backward, a movement that was both symbolic and practical. She was removing herself from the center of royal authority, beginning a retreat that would culminate in her complete separation from the monarchy she had served for over a decade. "The powers hereby granted," the Lord Chamberlain proclaimed, "include authority over all ceremonial functions of the Crown, supervision of royal household administration, and the right to act as head of state in all matters until such time as His Majesty the King returns and assumes direct control. These were extraordinary powers that effectively made William a temporary monarch with all the authority that title implied. He could approve government legislation, meet with foreign heads of state, and make decisions that would normally require the king's personal approval. The constitutional implications were staggering and would require careful management to avoid setting precedents that could complicate future successions. The Prime Minister stepped forward to formally acknowledge the new arrangement on behalf of the government. Her Majesty's government recognizes the authority hereby conferred upon His Royal Highness and pledges full cooperation in maintaining constitutional continuity during this transition period. This governmental endorsement was essential because it confirmed that the elected leadership supported the monarchy's internal reorganization. Without this backing, the entire process could have been seen as an internal palace coup rather than a legitimate constitutional mechanism. Captain Morrison, representing the military and security services, added his institutional support. The armed forces and security services recognize His Royal Highness as the legitimate exercise of royal authority and pledge their continued loyalty and service. Military backing was crucial because it demonstrated that the traditional pillars of state power stood behind the emergency measures being taken. Any suggestion that this was an illegitimate seizure of power was eliminated by the public support of institutions that had served the crown for centuries. The ceremony was nearing its conclusion, but the most delicate moment remained. Camilla had to be formally relieved of her titles and positions, a process that required her public acknowledgement of the decision. The Lord Chamberlain approached her with a final document that required her signature. "Your Majesty," he said, using her title for what would likely be the final time. "This document formally acknowledges your understanding of the Privy Council's decision and your agreement to relinquish all titles, honors, and positions associated with your role as Queen Consort." Camilla took the ornate pen offered to her and signed her name with steady handwriting. The signature completed her legal separation from the monarchy and formally ended her status as a member of the royal family. Years of service, public appearances, and personal sacrifice were concluded with the stroke of a pen. "The transition of responsibilities will be immediate," William announced, speaking publicly for the first time since accepting the regency powers. "All ceremonial duties, charitable patronages, and official functions previously conducted by the Queen Consort will be redistributed among other members of the royal family." This redistribution had already been planned in detail. Catherine would assume many of the charitable patronages, while other senior royals would absorb the ceremonial duties. The machinery of monarchy would continue without interruption, demonstrating the institution's resilience and adaptability. The assembled dignitaries began to disperse as the formal ceremony concluded. Quiet conversations started among the participants as they processed what they had witnessed and began to consider the implications for their own roles and responsibilities. Constitutional history had been made, and everyone present understood the significance of their participation. Camilla found herself standing alone as the room emptied around her. The transformation was complete, and she was no longer at the center of royal activity but rather an observer of events that would continue without her participation. The isolation was profound and immediate. Prince William approached her one final time, his demeanor now reflecting his new status but still maintaining personal courtesy. "The car is ready to take you to your new residence," he said quietly. "The staff there has been briefed and will ensure your comfort and security." The new residence was a Georgian manor house in the Cotswolds, chosen for its privacy and security features. Camilla would be comfortable there, but she would also be effectively removed from the royal world that had been her life. The isolation was intentional, designed to allow the monarchy to rebuild its reputation without the distraction of her continued presence. As Camilla prepared to leave Buckingham Palace for the final time as a member of the royal family, news of the dramatic events was already being prepared for public release. Press statements were being finalized, international diplomatic channels were being briefed, and the machinery of modern media management was being activated to control the narrative around this unprecedented development. The official announcement would describe Camilla's departure as a voluntary decision to focus on private charitable work due to health concerns. The truth about the investigation and the constitutional crisis would remain classified, known only to the select few who had participated in the decision-making process. Outside the palace gates, Tourists continued their daily routine of photographing the building and watching the changing of the guard, completely unaware that they had witnessed one of the most significant days in modern royal history. The monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to manage change while maintaining the appearance of eternal stability. Prince William stood at the window of the throne room, watching Camilla's departure convoy disappear through the palace gates. In a few hours, he would receive word that King Charles had landed and was returning to assume control of the crisis. But for now, he held powers that few heirs apparent had ever exercised, and the weight of the crown rested entirely on his shoulders. The transformation was complete. The threat to the monarchy had been neutralized, royal authority had been preserved, and the institution had once again demonstrated its ability to survive by adapting to changed circumstances. History would record this day as a successful defense of the crown's integrity. But those who participated understood the personal costs that institutional survival sometimes required.